Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to again welcome Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. Nice to see you again.
No worries. Now, our weather is low 20s or just a little high teens, and a little bit of rain, not a lot, but a little bit. How is it in Canada? Are you still getting your minus 40 degrees?
No, that has changed. We've had It's been up to 17 or 18 above Celsius, and however, it's a little cooler this coming week, maybe around 5 or 6, but
Hmm,
maybe a tiny bit of rain, but not much.
hmm, hmm.
But to you, that's probably freezing.
Oh yeah, that's well past freezing. Where I come from, 5 or 6
Yeah,
is that's the dread. That's the middle of winter, the
yes.
bleakest time, shortest day, all that sort of thing. That's what we would get 5 or 6 on a really cold day. And of course, the hills behind us, we might even find snow. But of course, where you are, you can get so many feet of snow, and it goes for so many months. So that's completely different. Yeah.
Yes, my brother down east said that he had 8 inches of solid ice on his driveway and snow around up to 4 feet.
Mm. 8 inches. I mean, seriously, think about
That,
that. It's just how would you
that's
even
ice.
how would you even get out of the driveway?
Well, he tried the other day on foot and he slipped and fell and right
Mm.
back. He said his feet just went out from under him and he hit his head on the ice, actually. Fortunately, it appears to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's not funny when you think about that. Going out on
Very
an
serious.
ice skating rink, a sloping ice skating rink, if it's like any other driveway that I know, and yes, the high probability of hazards that's out there. No worries. All right, I want to bring us back on topic because the greeting is
Yes,
always good, and it's lovely to see how the other side of the world really is going.
it's fairing.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. The topic being history of the social credit movement, and of course the Alberta, Canada, was the first social credit government. But the history of that was a bit of frustration because, of course, in the end, the government was actually undermined. At least the Social Credit Party was undermined, and that really sets the stage for today's discussion. Wallace.
Well, yes, they really considered themselves not to be a party, to be a movement. And in a sense, that was true because there had been a large background. There'd been an intellectual social credit movement in Canada
Hmm.
amongst completely, more or less, more educated people, but it wasn't terribly well known because it hadn't developed to a large extent. The party it developed an enormous following in Alberta, yes, it did, but that was because William Aberhart, had been an evangelist and he had developed a strong radio following.
Hmm.
And then he happened upon Morris Colburn's book, The Meaning of Social Credit,
Hmm.
and he was very impressed with that. And of course, the conditions of the Depression were such that he was paying very closely attention to these things. He did have a tremendous empathy for
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
and that's what brought him into it. He didn't run in the election in 1934. He actually was brought in. There was a seat that was vacated, and then he was brought in
Hmm.
later the next year, actually, to become the leader of the government.
Mm, that's fascinating. Just to give a heads up to our viewers that the Morris Colburn book, I'm just going to bring it up here. I've just found it. The meaning of social credit is in 4 parts on our website, and so you can actually pick that up, and there it is available for you to do your scholarship, to do your reading, and have a look and see if the arguments presented to Aberhart are sufficient. I know that when I heard that Aberhart had read that book and it was enough to convince him, I realised, also acknowledged the fact that he was in if you like, a strong evangelical, fertile ground
Mm-hmm.
for a revelation, if you like, the outworking of the revelation of Christianity, and that to me
Mm-hmm.
is most profound. That if you like, social credit is rooted in Christianity. It is one and the same thing. It's actually the outworking or the incarnating of the philosophy, the policy of the philosophy of Christianity. Wallace.
Well, yes, when Douglas did his initial investigations of the costing problem, He was an engineer, a British engineer of wide experience around the world. He didn't go into it with any thoughts of any religious bias or anything like that. He just did it as a scientific inductive study of what was going on in the costing system at the Royal Aircraft Works in Farnborough in England, and
Hmm.
he came to his conclusions on a perfectly scientific way. But over time, as people studied social credit, Christians, many came to conclude that actually what Douglas discovered and what he recommended in terms of means to rectify the defect in the price system, that it actually reflected Christian philosophy in a practical sense.
Hmm.
In fact, yeah, and so that is the way it came about. He didn't start going at it from a specifically doctrinal Christian manner. He simply looked for reality. He was looking for reality, and he found it
Hmm.
in the price system.
I find that fascinating. The looking forward in reality, because if you like, you sort of attempt to look at the world as to how it actually outworks, and in that outworking, it's not a an abstract theory that you actually put into practice and then find that it fails, but you actually look at the outworking. And I think this is, to me, this is most important. You use the word inductive, and of course that's the Baconian method, the scientific approach, that you take into account observation, observation, observation. You come to a hypothesis. You continue to take into account observation, 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 testing, rigorously looking, seeing if the hypothesis holds. And if it does hold, good. And if it doesn't, then you have to come up with a new hypothesis. Now,
Right.
I'm just going to touch on this and then we'll get back on subject. But that to me is the very reverse of what we're seeing with this anthropogenic global warming, that the hypothesis and everything is being manipulated to force the hypothesis to be true when all of these scientific observations show it to be false. And so there needs to be a new hypothesis. But coming back to the Baconian method, which to me is most important, the
Mm-hmm.
outworking of how it is in the real world. Now, I look on the, if you like, the world that's there, and I see a world of absolute abundance, a world of plenty. Now, these Albertan people in their outworking, they were going through particularly difficult times. And it was when they looked at the natural world that it became apparent that the financial system was to blame for actually an imposition, a false philosophy, like wool over their eyes. Wallace.
Well, of course, this was emerging from the Roaring Twenties when credit had been made abundantly available by the
Hmm.
banking institutions, and it had stimulated an enormous amount of economic activity, which translated into the production and the invention of all sorts of new goods and services. It
Hmm.
was really a very dynamic period, and then to be plunged suddenly into this state of destitution
Hmm.
where you couldn't even sell your product because it cost more to take it to market than it was worth
Hmm.
and you could get for it. And they were plowing under crops and throwing uh, um, products into the sea and generally destruction. Just it was more profitable to destroy your product than it was to try and get it to market. It was hopeless. It was just a disaster. People being, dispossessed of their property and their assets, and so it was a very dramatic change of scene,
Okay.
and
I just
and
want.
it's enough to make people wonder how could things change in the real world in such a drastic way unless you actually ran out of resources. Well,
Mm,
if you can't sell your product and you're actually destroying it, that's hardly an indication that you've run out of your natural resources. It means that something else is seriously wrong.
okay. I want to jump in here, Wallace. You've closed out really well on that, and where I want to jump in on is weights and measures. Weights and measures. And Kane, apparently, I think it was under Josephus, his book, said that Kane was the author of Weights and Measures. Now, to me, weights and measures, and I put it that that's exactly what the financial system is weights and measures, are a reflection of what's actually in the real world. It's a fraud. It's a fraud. It's a fraud in the sense that we have this abundance now. In the late 1920s, there was, if you like, the Roaring Twenties. There was a time of mechanical advantage, of industry, of manufacturing. Nothing in comparison to what it is today. And yet our weights and measures show that we have this huge debt, when in actual fact what we have is a huge credit. So it's a false weights and measures. And I believe that naming the financial system as a form of weights and measures is to me is an unraveling, if you like, or a demesmerizing of the purpose of that system. Wallace.
Well, you have to realize that the financial system is not a bunch of tokens floating around in the community or circulating. The financial system in the modern world is just a currency. The industrial system borrows from the community in order to get the real resources required to produce. They borrow to do that. They have a debt outstanding, and they have to recover that through the sales of their product. That's the way the system works,
Mhm,
and it's just accepted that you have to recover your costs and you have to cover them from the consumer, from sales.
mhm,
And if the consumer is not prepared, not equipped with the sufficient demand, effective demand,
mhm,
to acquire those goods and at the same time provide for the liquidation of the costs that were created in producing them,
mhm,
so that the producer can go back and pay off his production loan, then of course the situation is what some people have called a cost of economy. It's bound up. It's not functioning, and the problem is at the consumption end. Uh, Consumption is frustrated, and that causes the whole thing to back up, and business goes into a state of lassitude, and then if business does stop producing, it's not because of the lack of actual real resources in terms of not only human but non-human resources. It is a result of a factor that is artificially entering into the situation to prevent um, them from producing because they have no market. You can't go on producing if you have no market. You have to slow down. You
mhm,
have to pull back.
mhm.
But if there's a genuine desire or need for goods and services, that is obviously something very drastically and fundamentally is wrong, because money, being just a currency, should never be in short supply. It's like saying that you're short of pounds or short of inches.
Mhm,
It's ridiculous. I mean,
mhm,
money is simply a means of conveying information, a means by which production is allowed, permitted, or facilitated, and financial costs are created, and they have to be recovered. And consumption is the only source of liquidating those costs. So if the consumer is involved in consumption.
mhm,
The purpose of production is consumption. It's not to keep people busy or to give them jobs or to blow the world up, or it's just absolutely not
mhm,
that. It is
mhm.
it's consumption, and that is the satisfaction of the needs of human beings.
Okay, I just want to clarify something here, Wallace, and that
Mm-hmm.
is the relationship. The relationship that the individual now has to the community is different since advanced control, since automation, since robotics, since industrialization. The relationship that the individual has to the community is different, and it's not reflected in the financial system, in this ability to liquidate costs. And I wonder if you just explore that thought further, please.
Well, I'm not sure what you're getting at exactly, but we have to look at the economy as a flow of costs, a flow that it's a rate of a volume of flow. And we have to look at incomes, consumer incomes, in the same way. And if things balanced properly, they would be equivalent. but they're not. Our incomes are flowing at a much smaller rate of flow than the actual financial costs and prices that are being generated.
Hmm.
And that is because under the present financial system, it's not intuitive in a sense, but it's the case that the way the system works, because of the need to repay debts, repay loans, the money that is being released is actually prematurely canceled. It is going back and being canceled before the final goods of this cycle, this current cycle of goods, emerges from the production line.
Hmm.
And so the orthodox assumption has been that the act of production always liberated an equivalent in purchasing power and everything balanced. Well, obviously, if you got $2 or $3 trillion worth of debt out there, something isn't balanced. That's quite obvious.
That's right. That's right. And
And
where I wanted
so,
to where I wanted to take us, Wallace, was that the individual acts in association now. That industry is actually the outworking of the cultural inheritance. That the technology that the industry implements, that the industry's access to the raw materials in order to actually produce the the items within the productive system, that they actually a lot of them are from vast, not necessarily from the individual farmer, but necessarily from vast quarries or pits of raw materials that are there that actually belong to the community, and
yes,
and the outworking of that policy is is and should be towards the derived benefit of the community as individuals working in association. That's where I'm coming from, that the financial system doesn't actually take that into account. And that's why when we talk about social credit looks at this thing of the individuals working in association, that there are natural increments, that there are inheritances that belong to each person equally, and that outworking of those things are reflected in the national dividend and the consumer price subsidy, that they're actually an outworking of the cultural inheritance. And that, to me, is the anomaly, that while we talk about the inadequacy of the price system to find equilibrium, the response to it, the actual response in the natural world, is that the distribution of sufficient purchasing power has to be apportioned to each individual in community, in association, but each individual, so that they can
right.
choose or refuse from industry one thing, or from government one thing at a time. Wallace.
Well, what you're saying is that from the beginning of human history, we have developed tools, and those tools have become more sophisticated and more productive as we go on. Those tools and the knowledge of how to make them and how to use them has been passed on from one generation to another as an inheritance.
Hmm.
It's an inheritance that belongs to the community as such. It's
Hmm.
just knowledge and technique, ability, and so on.
Hmm.
It doesn't belong to any specific group or class of people. It belongs to the community as such. And that inheritance is not recognized by the existing financial system
Hmm.
because the system assumes essentially that in order for the economy to work properly, everyone has to be employed.
Hmm.
That implies that human labor is the source of all wealth. Well, human labor is a source of wealth, but it's an incremental thing that builds, but it builds more slowly than, and it doesn't really build that much because human beings are really capable of only so much efficiency as an organism. You can only lift so much. That's all you can do. And you really can't gain an advantage unless you develop some device, knowledge, or technique to give you an extra productivity. Capability in that sense. And that's what we've done in a way that really is beyond what would have been our greatest expectations and hopes. I mean, it's astonishing.
Hmm.
And so that is it. And because and it's really, again, it's this problem of the incarnation of ideas, the making them, the implementing them in a practical way, and governing your activities by abstractions.
Hmm.
Now, abstractions have to do with morality. We have certain ideas about morality. What is it that humans should do in terms of rightness? What is it that keeps people in a state of proper rectitude? What disciplines them? And that's when you get into judgmentalism.
Hmm.
And you are moving away from the real world because in the real world, things just happen.
Hmm.
Animals, birds, fish, they function. They don't get into a big debate about whether or not one or all of them should be doing something to keep the rest of them, keep them all moral.
Hmm.
The world was created. Unless you assume that whatever created the world, God or whatever you say, didn't know what he was doing and made some big errors, and that only we can fix it.
Hmm.
And we can only fix it by making people industrious, even if we have to produce enormous amounts of armaments in order to distribute incomes to to obtain goods that we've produced in the past.
Hmm.
I mean, it's quite insane. It's a very it's a very, I would say, evil
Hmm.
situation because what you're doing is you're looking at your fellow man in a judgmental manner and saying that he has to be disciplined.
Hmm.
Now, there's an old adage saying, mind your own business.
Hmm.
It's sadly in need of attention.
Hmm.
I think the world would work much better if people did that
Hmm. Hmm.
because they would be looking after their own affairs in a responsible manner, which would be beneficial to the community.
Yeah.
But when you spend all of your time worrying about your neighbor doing something wrong and that he might be committing a sin or something,
Hmm.
you're not really doing too much to generate a positive atmosphere in society.
So getting back to the Alberta people, they're studying
Mm-hmm.
this question of social credit, and social credit in itself is not just a response to the financial system, although it's a significant response towards the financial system because the financial system is the tool used to control people. And so its response is there. But they actually they saw further than just the financial system. They also saw that the opportunity or the entitlement to have a say in how government should be run and the actual outworking of policy in their own lives was their inherent right. It's not something that is, if you like, abstracted out there in a theoretical you need to work, otherwise you won't be a moral or ethical person, but rather that you should be free to do the things that you choose to do, providing you don't impose or in what would you call it, harden yourself towards someone else what they do,
Mm-hmm.
minding
Mm-hmm.
your own business. I think that's interesting because it's not just money that you talk. It's also the whole philosophy of leave the person alone to get on with their own life. Wallace.
Well, we have to also be careful not to mix abstract ideas with reality. Social credit is, at base, the ability of human beings to associate
Hmm.
in a manner that generates increments of association which are beneficial. It is satisfying to individuals,
Hmm.
quite aside from the money question.
Hmm.
But we use money in such a way, money is used by contract. We do not trade by barter today. We have very complex economies which involves it must involve accountancy so that we can have rational apportionment or use of resources and distribution of product.
Hmm.
And so that when you develop an abstract system like money, which is separated from the real productive and consuming system,
Hmm.
you have to ask the question: is this a true representation of what we're actually physically doing or
Hmm.
wanting to do?
Hmm.
And it would be rather careless or assuming to conclude that our abstract system, which we have concocted, if you might say, is necessarily a reflection of reality.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
is a pretty big jump to
It's,
make.
it certainly is. It certainly, to me, it says, I'm mindful of the time, Wallace. It certainly says to me that the financial system is in need of a significant review to place it back into the nature of how things are
Mm-hmm.
at the moment, how things are with industrialization, with automation, with robotics, advanced control, the amount of solar energy that we actually harness, not just from the sun, from hydrocarbons, which is an outworking of the sun, the actual techniques that are there, more efficiency, and of course, the other side of it too, which I know that, if you like, the Guild Socialists touched on with when they were involved in the guilds, and that was the quality of workmanship. And I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
very important part that if you're going to build a car, then you build a car that doesn't rust. You actually put cathodic protection in and you galvanize the potential rusting parts and you put cathodic protection in. You put a pre-lubricating oil system, exotic oil system, so that the engine is protected. And instead of limiting the life cycle to 150,000 kilometers, it could be 1.5 million kilometers. And on that basis, you only need to produce 1 out of 10 cars instead of 10 cars. So there is an ethical, in a sense, an ethical um, inherent within the manufacturing that can actually be responded to, and that is that obsolescence is done away with because the financial system is in equilibrium. These can go to such a far-reaching effect, including an environmental response. That's why social credit is not restricted just to numbers, just to balancing the books. Wallace.
No, I mean, there are consequences that follow from balancing the economy. That's certain. One of the consequences is that you no longer have to produce something else before you can acquire something that you previously produced.
Hmm.
And when the situation gets greater and greater, it gets into a crescendo of destructive activities,
Hmm.
which is not good for the environment, is not good for you as a human being,
Hmm.
and it just makes a frenetic sort of situation. Industry's caught betwixt and between. They have to give attention to quality, but at the same time, they have to give attention to increase sales.
That's right.
And they've got to sort of reach some kind of a balance, which of course they can never do.
Hmm.
It's just a very difficult situation.
Mm.
And it's destabilizing. It creates an unstable society,
Mm.
unstable economy, and it draws away from culture because people cannot be cultured unless they have time to live, time to reflect, time to think, time to visit with their neighbors, to study past history.
Hmm.
If you're just running to produce things in order to survive, you're deprived of that. You've been deprived of your right to look at culture,
Mm.
to look back on culture in the past and to speculate about what might be in the future.
Mm.
You just simply are, you're becoming a machine yourself.
Yeah, and I see that so much today that I've got sons and daughters, and I look at them and I love them dearly, and how are they able to manage, and how are they not able to manage, and yes, I see them. Their times just swallowed up, just surviving, and it's quite frustrating. The people of Alberta, when they were going through this, if you like, this situation of the Roaring Twenties and then the Great Depression, they were actually involved in study groups, and then the outworking of the election, of which the Social Credit Party was installed, and then the party was subverted, Wallace. So really the heads up about how that party was subverted, because to me the if you like the Christian who might be listening, or the potential conservative who might be listening to this broadcast, why do they have to be so cautious of parties? What was the example set in Alberta that is so disconcerting?
Well, one of the problem was a lack of knowledge because when the people were elected, they were, except for relatively few who were pretty well informed on the social credit position, most of them were not. And so there was a period when things were in a bit of turmoil and no real constructive action was taken.
Hmm.
And of course, that brought a rebellion within the ranks of the party.
Hmm.
And but it turned out that Aberhart, not knowing what to do, actually made arrangements with a man called Magor and actually financed the debt of the province. And so that was not a social credit movement. And Douglas did send a couple of emissaries from Britain,
Hmm.
and they were very well informed. But it just it got to the point where the Aberhart, as we know, died prematurely.
Hmm.
He himself, I don't think, was too enamored of the political approach, the party approach. I think he once said that, I understand he once said that if he were to do it again, he would seek out intelligent and young men of integrity across the country in order to generate a groundswell of demand for
Mhm.
the social credit measures. And
Mhm.
that's what Douglas said. He said, you want to make your representatives a misery, make
Mhm.
their lives a misery until
Mhm.
they give you what you want.
Mm.
I mean, if they show cooperation, then you cooperate with them, of course.
Mhm.
But they have to have sanctions. They have to know that you mean business and that
Mhm.
you have the knowledge that is there to back up your demands.
Mhm.
And that's the thing. It can't just come because politics essentially is a process of seeking power. It's a
Mm.
power game, and it's corrupt. Let's face it. It is
Mm.
intrinsically, by nature, corrupt,
Mhm.
and it's not going to give you what you want unless you let your representatives know that they're serving you and not the party machine
Mm. I
or
just
whoever controls it.
No worries. Thank you, Wallace. I just want to actually highlight some publications that have recently been placed on our website, which I think are most important. And in particular, a recent one by, when I say recent, recently placed up, is by Professor Keaton, Passing of Parliament. And there's also this one here. Now, where is it? What was his? Was it Acton? It wasn't Acton. It was. There it is. No, no. I got it. Burberry. There it is. Hewitt of Burberry, The New Despotism. Sorry for the stumbling. The New Despotism and the Passing of Parliament are most profound writings, and what they illustrate, in my mind, that will help us understand this is the power of the bureaucracy. Now we talk about the London School of Economics and the Harvard and Princeton and all those elite Oxford, all those elite institutions of learning, and
Mm-hmm.
those are elite because they are essentially, if you like, institutions that prepared our current level of bureaucrats, and this is
Mm-hmm.
right throughout the world. And those bureaucrats are the ones who control the politicians. Those bureaucrats are the ones who control really the way legislation is written and how law is not it's not something like the common law, because in that it's limited to, well, the law is the same for the lion and the lamb in a sense that the law is there. The interpretation for the judge, the difference between lion and lamb. But what it is it's arbitrary law. It's arbitrary law that if the outcome today says this, but we're not happy with the result, the minister can make a determination and that can be changed on the spot, and the courts will uphold it. They're most profound things. And that means that there's no, if you like, there's no surety, there's no confidence that the system is solid and a basis to move forward. But it's in this state of flux that we find ourselves in where we do have a lack of confidence in what's going on. And I guess the purpose of these discussions is to find our way through to restore confidence in our institutions and to restore order in our community, in our culture, in our civilization, in our nation. Wallace Clink, thank you so much for today.
That's fine, Arnie. Nice to be with you again.
No worries, and I look forward soon enough to our next broadcast. Arnie Luks at the Freedom Forum.